Today from the global lane, potential enemy on Israel's border, Kurdish fears rising over Syria's new leader and the creation of an Islamic caliphate.
Well, actually, they're very deeply concerned. These are Salafi jihadis. We know that these are people who in their not too distant past were burning churches.
The state of American education and foreign influences.
143 districts around the country in 34 states had accepted teachers, money, curriculum, or other programming from the Chinese government.
The Pennsylvania assassination attempt strengthened Donald Trump's belief in God. For this President's Day, we look at the faith of some of America's favorite presidents.
George Washington, in his farewell address, he says, those people that want to get rid of religion, they're actually pulling down the pillars of our country.
Prelude to peace talks. Russia's Putin frees an American history teacher from prison. And it's all right here on the global lane. Clash over Syria's future. Two opposing visions. One allied with Turkey President Erdogan and adherence to Islamic law. The other espousing secularism, human rights, and an equal role for women. Which future will Syria embrace? And what role must the United States and Israel play? Joining us with more from Jerusalem is Middle East Quarterly editor and journalist Jonathan Spire. Jonathan, you've just returned from the Kurdish Autonomous Region of northern Syria with the Kurdish leadership and members of the Syrian Defense Forces. So are they hopeful that a new government will include them, or do they fear ongoing fighting with Islamists and the Turks?
Well, I would say that the official version, which you hear from the very top officials, or at least which I heard from the very top officials of the SDF, of the Syrian Kurdish leadership, maintains a tone of optimism, or at least neutrality, regarding that, the direction of events. But I think as soon as you speak to anybody who's not sort of being very careful to give you that line in the Syrian Kurdish areas, then what you actually hear is a tone of very deep concern, whereby what they'll kind of tell you is, yeah, we know these people. We know who Jabhat al-Nusra, which then became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, are. We know that these are Salafi jihadis. We know that these are people who in their not too distant past were burning churches and were committing atrocities against Kurds and other non-Arabs or non-Muslims. So actually, they're very deeply concerned, I think. And I think, in fact, many of them will tell you that within a year or two, they expect a kind of test of power between the two, whereby HTS, as it indeed says it's going to do, will try one way or another to force the Kurdish-controlled areas back under the control of Damascus. And the Kurds, certainly if they're forced into that situation, intend to contest that.
Syria's interim leader Abu Mohammed al-Julani has expressed gratitude to Israel for weakening Iran and Hezbollah's influence in Syria. What do you see developing with that relationship? Friendship, neutrality, hostility?
I find it very hard to believe that there will be friendship. It is worth remembering that in the not distant past at all, prior to November of this year, when last year, when HTS began its march, its remarkable march on Damascus. But prior to that time, HTS was controlling, of course, an enclave in Idlib province in northwest Syria, which it controlled for 7 years prior to 2024. Leading leaders and so-called spiritual leaders in that space were strongly supportive of the October 7th massacres and are on record as being so.
Al-Julani recently met with Turkey President Erdogan. How great is Erdogan's influence on Al-Julani? And to what extent do you expect him to be involved in brokering the nation's future?
First of all, it needs to be understood that Julani and HTS's triumph is equally a triumph for Erdogan. What I mean by that is that had it not been for Erdogan's stubborn and, as it turns out, prescient insistence on not abandoning that little 10% enclave in northwest Syria that he kept control of, at a time when throughout the region and indeed throughout the world, including in the West, people were saying, no, the Syrian war is over. Assad has won. Why is Erdogan insisting on keeping this little dusty enclave of jihadis going? Well, it turns out that as a result of his doing that, his allies, let's say, ended up in control now of most of the country.
Initially, President Trump sounded like he was indifferent to what was happening inside Syria, and he suggested, well, Turkey has wanted to control parts of Syria for years. He's even suggested withdrawing U.S. troops from bases there in the northeast. What should he do about Syria in the days ahead?
Well, let us remember that there is roughly around 40,000 ISIS and ISIS-associated prisoners currently in the hands of the Syrian Democratic Forces inside Kurdish-controlled or SDF-controlled north and eastern Syria. There have been a series of ISIS attacks in Syria over the last months. There, of course, have been ISIS and ISIS-associated attacks in the United States in the same period of time. So on the most basic level, it is, I think, a U.S. interest to make sure those 40,000 prisoners don't go free. I was just visiting one of the internment camps of those ISIS prisoners, the Al-Hol camp up in northern Syria, close to the border, just a few weeks ago. And people there were telling me that the prisoners there were jubilant when they saw Jolani's people marching into Damascus, because they considered that, okay, Damascus is free now, so-called, and will be next.
It seems that al-Jolani has done what ISIS could not and may be on his way to creating a Syrian caliphate.
I think that's right in a lot of ways. I think Jolani's career is remarkable in the following way. The usual pattern for Salafi jihadi Islamists of that type, and ISIS were, and bin Laden of Al-Qaeda was as well, is that as soon as they get any strength on the ground, which they can do through their military determination sometimes, then they turn out to be geopolitical lunatics. And what they do is they then pick a fight with forces vastly stronger than themselves, and are then subsequently destroyed by those forces. That's what happened. That was the trajectory of bin Laden's career. That was the trajectory of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Islamic State's career. And the remarkable thing about al-Jolani and HTS is that they have managed to pursue a different trajectory, whereby once they achieve political power, they then actually use it smartly as opposed to crazily.
And I'm sure Israel is watching developments in Syria closely. The Kurds want them to be involved as well, not just the U.S. What can and should Israel do at this point to influence the new regime?
Regarding influencing the new regime, I think that Israel is limited in what it can do, because Israel doesn't have, ways of influence into the kind of circles of which Ahmed Shara al-Jolani is a part, for kind of obvious reasons. Israel can do what it's currently doing, which is it can ensure that Israeli communities in the Golan Heights are kept safe, because Israel has kind of carved out a small buffer zone of its own inside Syria, same in a way as the Turks do in the north, or arguably the Americans do in the east. And if the Shara government in Damascus becomes hostile, then, Israel will take such measures as it deems necessary. In the past, against Assad, against Hezbollah, against the Iranians on Syrian soil, Israel was very determined. And I'm sure that Israel will pursue an equal determination to ensure the safety of its citizens against any other government in Damascus that may turn its hand against it.
Okay, we'll see what develops. Jonathan Spire, thanks for being with us.
Indeed.
Dismantling the Department of Education. President Trump says it is time to remove the federal government from the business of educating America's children.
So we're ranked number 40 out of 40 schools, right? We're ranked number 1 in cost per pupil. So we spend more per pupil than any other country in the world. And we're ranked at the bottom of the list. We're ranked very badly. And what I want to do is let the states run schools.
What has caused this? What needs to be done? Nicole Neely is president and founder of Parents Defending Education. Nicole, you recently testified before Congress on the state of American education. So what did you tell members of the House Education and Workforce Committee? Why has it gotten worse?
Unfortunately, the state of our education system is not great. We saw the NAEP scores that came out recently showing that surprise, surprise, American school children are not doing very well. They're not reading or doing math or proficiency. And in fact, the students that were most impacted by that are actually the lowest performers. And so the bottom really fell out. It's really devastating, because you think we basically have a lost generation of children. Because if you can't read by 3rd grade, your chances for success in life, sadly, are greatly diminished, because that's such a core skill. And so this really merits significant investigation and attention. And it's something that, frankly, over the past 4 years, the Biden administration has spent money and paid attention to everything but the quality of children's education.
Well, it seems like it's a matter of priorities, so let's get into some specifics here. You testified that intrusive mental health counseling, telling children they're in the wrong body, is not a good use of tax dollars. It destroys parent-child relationships. So tell us more.
I mean, can you imagine that this is how our tax dollars are being used through mental health counseling, through school-based health centers? and just ongoing social emotional learning. We have seen gender ideology inserted into basically every aspect of children's education. I mean, I spoke to a parent a couple years ago who said that he asked his kindergarten teacher, we're Catholic, we'd like to opt our children out of gender materials. And they said, we can't, it's in everything. He said, what do you mean it's in everything? They're 5. It was in math, it was in social studies, it was in history. And so when you have something like that that's so pervasive going into very, very young ages, I mean, these are children who still believe in the tooth fairy. Yet now we have people who, elected officials and then also school officials who are determined to rip our children's innocence away. It's really mind-boggling that that is considered a viable use of taxpayer dollars.
Well, we know that parental rights is one big reason Glenn Youngkin was elected governor right here in Virginia. So what are your concerns about creating division, not only between child and parent, but also between students over race, sex, and equity?
Certainly. I mean, when we see DEI programming put in place, there was a great meta study done by a group called the Network Contagion Research Institute. And it showed that, surprise, surprise, when you teach children to view themselves as others through the lens of immutable characteristics, race, sex, etc., it creates divisions between people and it leads to worse interpersonal relationships. And so to watch all these districts over the past several years spend millions upon millions of dollars. I mean, all of that ESSER money that was used, that was supposed to be used to reopen schools during COVID, in blue states like California and Illinois, went straight to DEI programming. That money would have been better off lit on fire because at least it would have kept people warm instead of making our children hate each other. So the fact that this is considered, a core element of school right now, they have our children for 7 or 8 hours a day. Why are they spending so much time on identity politics? Why are we not focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic?
Well, and as a result of school DEI programs, they've bloated administrative budgets. I know at the congressional hearing, a chart was presented showing the rising growth of administrative staff compared to teachers and classrooms between 2000 and 2019. Administrative staff rose 88%. While student and teacher growth was up only 8%. So why and how did that happen?
It's a lot of middle managers. It's a lot of administrative staff, DEI officials, et cetera. But I think it really underscores the point that the money is not getting into classrooms. And I think part of that problem is that it's coming from the federal government. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And so when our tax dollars go to the federal government, obviously they skim money off the top for themselves, but then they send it back out to the states with a lot of strings attached. There's a lot of reporting that goes along with that. There are expectations for, elementary schools to have Title IX officers, things like that. And so, yeah, the money is going to management rather than to teacher salaries. And we're putting huge amounts of expectations on teachers, forcing them to be gender transition counselors, emotional support animals, punching bags. But the teachers are hired to be a math teacher, to be an English teacher. And so it's placing our teachers in a really untenable spot, as well as obviously not helping our children actually learn.
So school choice, is that an alternative, a good solution?
I think it's a terrific idea because then people can vote with their feet. If they go to a private school and they're not happy with the quality of education that they receive, they can leave. I mean, I think that's a terrific built-in accountability measure. Last year, actually, we left our private school because we were unhappy with what our kids were learning. My husband is homeschooling our kids now. We consider that a better use of our time and our money than to have our kids and, to have to spend several hours every day unprogramming them from everything that they learned at school. And so for families to know how their children learn and what environments they thrive in and what comports with their family values, I think is something that gives parents a lot of dignity in this process. And
Nicole, we have a large international audience, so tell us about the influence of China on American education through the financing and influence of what your organization calls little red classrooms. So what difference is that making?
We were astonished to discover this about 2 years ago. We first started looking into the Thomas Jefferson School for Science and Technology, which is based in Fairfax, and I identified about $1 million in overseas funding coming from CCP-linked entities. After we dug into this and flagged it for Governor Youngkin, we then thought, well, if this is happening here, is this happening elsewhere? And over the course of about a year, filing dozens of public records requests, we identified that 143 districts around the country in 34 states, including 20 near military bases, had accepted teachers, money, curriculum, or other programming from the Chinese government. And so that to us raises a number of concerns, both about what our children are learning and who has access to the data and student information that our schools collect.
Okay.
I think this merits significant investigation.
Indoctrination rather than education. Okay, there's much more to discuss here, but we're out of time. So if people want to get a hold of your organization, how do they do that?
Our website is defendinged.org. People can submit tips to us, flag things for us on social media, because we love to report out about what's going on in American schools.
Okay, Nicole Neely of Parents Defending Education, thank you for sharing your time and insights.
Thank you.
President's Day 2025, a day for America to pay tribute to its presidents. Many U.S. presidents knew their limitations and honored the one who truly made America great. Most of the country's presidents were men of faith, who acknowledged not only the country, but also the God they served. Here with us is Christian historian William Federer. He's author of the book, Prayers and Presidents, Inspiring Faith from Leaders of the Past. Bill, it's good to talk with you again. So first, I've got to ask you about the current U.S. president, Donald Trump. Here's what he said about his faith after the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt.
Honestly, it changed something in me. I feel even stronger. I believed in God, but I feel much more strongly about it. Something happened. So, thank you.
So, Bill, President Trump's near-death experience had a profound effect on his faith. He even signed an executive order establishing a faith office. So what do you think?
Yeah, I'm thrilled. Especially he's addressing anti-Christian bias. And anybody that keeps track of pro-life Catholics being arrested and 78-year-old grandmothers arrested at protesting abortion, to homeschooling moms or to parents that don't want their kids transitioned without their knowledge, that there's an attack on the Christian faith. And thankfully, Trump is addressing this. And he has acknowledged God. When you compare him to the other presidents, even in recent times, he's been the most outspoken about his Christian faith. And so I'm absolutely thrilled and think that the good Lord is giving us some time to try to reclaim this country for the godly purpose for which it was founded.
The late Jimmy Carter, who recently passed, was a president who many people say was perhaps the best at living out his faith after the presidency. So which U.S. president expressed the most openness about their faith, aside from Donald Trump, as you mentioned, while serving in the White House?
Yeah, well, you have Teddy Roosevelt, and over again, he mentions his Christian faith, and he talks about going into church and praising Almighty God. You had... even Franklin Roosevelt passed out Gideon's New Testaments and Book of Psalms to all the soldiers in World War II, millions of them. Harry S. Truman's the one who made the National Day of Prayer an annual event. Ronald Reagan made the National Day of Prayer the first Thursday in May. You had Lincoln in his inaugural address. He said, intelligence, patriotism, and Christianity and a firm reliance on him who has never yet forsaken this favored land are still competent to adjust in the best way all our present difficulty. So you had many leaders acknowledging God and their faith. Again, George Washington, in his farewell address, said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who would labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. So he was having getting rid of the anti-Christian bias. He says, those people that want to get rid of religion, they're actually pulling down the pillars of our country. So it's just important for us to understand the faith that the presidents had. Washington, Garfield was a minister, James Garfield. So it's inspiring to see some of them that we don't necessarily call religious. They still made declarations of faith. In Kennedy's inaugural address, he said, the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And Truman's inaugural address in 1949, we believe all men are created equal because we're created in the image of God. And Eisenhower had a prayer in his inaugural address, and so did George H.W. Bush. So, and Jimmy Carter, he did mention Micah 6:8. What doth the Lord require of thee, but to walk humbly with thy God, and so forth. But so it's Lincoln, again, he's the one who put in God we trust on our national coin. And that's something that he also is one that had the Emancipation Proclamation. And I love Ronald Reagan. He was pro-life, and he said in the Human Life Review, he said, Lincoln recognized that we could not survive as a free land when some men could decide that others were not fit to be free but should be slaves. Likewise, we cannot survive when some men decide that others should not live and should be abandoned to abortion. So we have a pro-life Lincoln and pro-life Ronald Reagan.
Okay, historian William Federer, thank you for providing those historic insights for this President's Day. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The luckiest man on earth. That's how Mark Fogel described his feelings as President Trump welcomed the Pennsylvania history teacher to the White House, just hours after his release from a Russian prison. Fogel had been held for more than 3 years simply for entering Russia with a small amount of medical marijuana that had been prescribed for his chronic back pain. During the meeting, he expressed his gratitude to everyone involved in negotiating his release.
I'm a middle-class school teacher who's now in a dream world. I love our country, and I'm so happy to be back here.
Fogel should never have attempted to enter Russia with a small amount of medical marijuana. Many countries have strict and restrictive laws regarding such substances. However, the Russians should have treated the prescribed cannabis no differently than other prescribed medications found in a visitor's luggage. Instead, they saw an opportunity to use an American to facilitate a prisoner exchange. Fogel's imprisonment was later prolonged due to the political situation surrounding the Ukraine war. President Trump stated that Fogel's release could serve as a catalyst for peace negotiations.
It could be a big, important part of getting the war over.
Let's pray that President Trump and Steve Witkoff can successfully negotiate an end to the Ukraine war. As Trump rightfully points out, too many lives have been lost and destroyed by those who have profited from perpetuating the misery. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Until next time, be blessed.